Welcome to Walk in the Shadows, a bi-weekly podcast with me, your host, Tim Woolworth. In this second series of our podcast, we will explore psychic detective work. When you hear the word psychic detective, a few things likely come to mind. Maybe you were envisioning a police officer who has an uncanny ability to solve cases, or maybe you were thinking of a medium that knows where the body is, or who committed the crime. The most puzzling cases involve innocent people who do not identify as being psychic, that have uncanny visions in their dreams, or they are physically visited by a discarnate entity that relays information. Psychic detective work can be these things and more, as we'll learn in this series. If the following content intrigues you, and you need to hear more, there are bonus episodes in this series for our Patreon subscribers to listen to at their leisure. With all topics we cover, the Walk in the Shadows bonus content expands upon the concepts in our episodes. For access to our bonus episodes, and several other perks including free merchandise, please visit our Patreon. The link is in the show notes. If I may have one more ask before we get to the good stuff, like and subscribe to our podcast. If you really vibe with what we're doing, please leave a review and tell a friend or two. It really does help. And now, let's dig into the enigmatic mystery that is psychic detective work. If you ever conduct a cursory search online for psychic detectives, you will see that there are several cases that have been solved with information that came from an unknown realm. Visions or visits from the other side have filled in the missing pieces throughout the centuries for detectives around the world. As we progress through this series, you should keep a couple questions in mind. Are psychics a valuable resource for police? And if so, why are they not used more? Recently, there have been cases that have made headline news. One such case included Philippe Durand, a Belgian psychic who was living in Sydney, Australia. Paula Brown had gone missing. Her fiancé approached Philippe to help find her. For the psychic, he relied on divination using a plumb bob, a tool shaped like a dowsing pendulum that is used in construction. He held the plumb bob over a map with a bit of Paula Brown's hair from her hairbrush set upon it. The plumb bob pointed to a specific area. In the end, Paula's body would be discovered less than 2 kilometers from the location the plumb bob pointed towards, a city 20 kilometers south of Sydney, called Port Botany. Since we're talking about cases in Australia, I need to mention the Thomas Brown case, which is truly spectacular. Thomas Brown went missing. He walked out of his girlfriend's house one morning, a few kilometers west of Honeymoon Gap in the Australian outback, and just simply disappeared. That particular area of Australia is very remote. The nearest city, Alice Springs, was about 25 kilometers away. An entire year had passed, and the police ran out of leads. Desperate to locate Thomas, Brown's family reached out to a well-known Aboriginal clairvoyant named Leanna Adams in Perth, Western Australia. In an altered state, the clairvoyant communed with a spirit lady who helped her to see the location of Brown's body. When the family relayed the information about where his corpse was located to the police, they refused to follow up, as it is official policy not to accept psychic detective help in Australia. Left with no other option, the family hired Adams to help them physically locate Brown. Adams traveled with the family over 3,600 kilometers, roughly some 2,200 miles, to an area outside Alice Springs in the Northern Territory. When they arrived, they hiked to a ridge 20 kilometers outside Alice Springs to the exact location where Brown's body was located. Emergency services removed the body, and it was subsequently identified as Thomas Brown. While these last two cases are exceptional, not all psychic detective tips are as successful. In fact, most tips don't pan out or are found to be blatantly false. Listeners of a certain age may remember when the famous psychic to the stars, Sylvia Brown, wrongly suggested, very publicly I might add, to the families of Amanda Berry and Sean Hornbeck that their missing loved ones were dead. Neither one of these persons were deceased, and were located later in time after suffering through personal tragedies. While there are countless stories where people claiming to be psychic detectives have failed in their attempts to solve cases, these will not be the focus of this series. They are simply not interesting, as anyone can guess wrongly where a victim or object might be. Instead, we will explore cases where information from an unknown realm has been imparted to normal people to help solve crimes. These are cases where people could not possibly know the accurate information that they wound up sharing with authorities. Before we progress further into Series 2 of Walk in the Shadows, please be aware that some episodes, like this one, will have mentions of crime and violence. I will endeavor to avoid overtly gratuitous descriptions of victims or crime scenes, but if you or anyone listening with you are sensitive to these topics, please be advised. The first case we'll cover in depth is an old case from the 17th century. This was a case where an everyday working man received some information from an unlikely source to help solve a crime that no one knew had even been committed. In early 17th century Britain, 1631 to be exact, Christopher Walker, a man of high local status, lived in County Durham in a home next to the Chester Moors. Christopher was a widow after his wife had unexpectedly passed on. To help him with the daily chores required of his home, his teenage niece, Anne, was sent to his home to tend to the work his wife had formerly done. As is expected, the local community had tongues wagging about the relationship between Anne and Christopher, considering she was young, attractive, and living with an older man. To uphold his name in the community and to quash any rumors, Christopher publicly stated, after Anne had disappeared, that he had sent his niece to go live with another family member and made sure everyone knew about it. A few weeks later, shortly before Christmas, a miller named James Graham was working in his mill one night when he heard some sounds coming from below. Immediately descending to the first floor, he saw an unwelcomed intruder in his mill, which had been closed to business for the night. Ready to fight, James soldiered on. What he met chilled him. It was a young girl who had been in some violent altercation. Her clothes were soiled and torn. She was bloodied from cuts across her forehead that led to her hair being a matted red clot. This caught James unawares, especially when he looked into her eyes, two globes that reflected back an unearthly, vacant look. Then the girl began to speak. He was not sure if the voice was real, or whether it was affixed to the flood of images that impressed themselves upon his thought when she spoke. He saw her story play out like a movie, in his mind's eye. The young woman informed him that her name was Anne Walker, and she described her trauma. She had been impregnated by her uncle Christopher, and because this was a social travesty that would ruin his reputation, he had sent her away. He had said that he had arranged a place for her to live in Lancashire until the child was born. Then she could come back if she wanted to. He handed her off one night to a miner, Mark Sharp, who would take her across the moors towards her destination, as he was making the same journey to return to work. She would never reach her destination. Following orders from Christopher, when they had traveled a short distance outside the village, deep into the moors where screams couldn't be heard, the miner did what he was paid to do. He struck her in the head with his miner's pick. He then buried her deep in a coal pit. With the body, he also buried his pick and his stockings, from which he could not remove the copious amounts of blood that soaked them after spurting out of her head as she lay dying on the ground. So he threw them in the pit to bury the evidence. After relaying this information to the miller, the girl faded away into the shadowy realm of specters. James knew he could not go to the magistrate with a ghost story, and on top of that, there would be ramifications to his personal business. Christopher Walker was a respected man in the community, and James was merely a lowly miller. As James bided his time, the specter returned both in visions and dreams, and told him there would be no rest until he tried to get justice for her. He eventually acquiesced and went to a Mr. Thomas Liddell, who served as the Chief Justice of their area. The miller was subjected to heavy questioning, and it was ascertained that he did not know Anne and had no reason for concocting such a tale. A search party was then formed. Anne Walker's body was found precisely where she had told James it would be. The pick and stockings were there as well. Both Walker and Sharp were arrested and sent to trial in nearby Durham. There was no circumstantial evidence to convict either man for murder, and it looked like it was a case with no standing. Yet, as the trial continued, a witness exclaimed that he could see Anne Walker's ghost standing in a corner of the courthouse, identifying her uncle as the man who killed her. They were both found guilty, due in part to the testimony of a ghost. I would be remiss if I did not address one of the most sensational cases of the modern era and the psychic detective that was involved. It was a case that made headlines around the world and filled the women of London with fear, as 5 women were killed in what appeared to be an occult manner. But some people say that up to 14 women may have become victim of a monster who walked among mankind. It began on the hot summer night of August 7th in 1888. Martha Tabram, 39 years old, had been drinking with 2 soldiers at a pub. She had been known as a heavy drinker. Her inclination towards the bottle had cost her a marriage of 6 years to her former husband, Henry. Being a divorcee, it was rumored that Martha moonlighted as a prostitute to make ends meet. It may have been for this purpose that she left the pub with a soldier shortly before midnight and wandered over to the George Yard building, an alley with tenement houses at the time, which is now known as Gunthorpe Street. Just a few short hours later, around 3:30 in the morning, a carriage driver noticed a person lying on the first floor of the George Yard building and assumed it was someone sleeping there. A bit after that, about 5 o'clock, Martha Tabram's body had been found by a dock worker on his way to clock in for the day. Martha had been stabbed 39 times very violently in the stomach, chest, and genitals with 2 weapons, a pocket knife for 38 of the wounds, and either a dagger or bayonet was used to pierce the chest with a single blow. There was a lineup, but there was no confirmed match of the soldier she had left with, nor anyone else for that matter, and the case was left unsolved. Martha is one of the 9 women who were murdered in a similar fashion, but not attributed to Jack the Ripper by the police. Being potentially his first victim, Martha did not have the hallmarks, including throat slashing and dissection, that the other women had. Yet the other victims, whether it be 5 or 13 besides her, were all murdered in the same general area, the Whitechapel district. Many serial killers fine-tune their methodology during the first murder or 2 and dial in their signature. Martha may have been a victim of the Ripper before he had figured out the signature for his murders that he notoriously became known for. The 5 victims that were attributed to Jack the Ripper by the police are now known as the Canonical 5. The first of the Canonical 5 was a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. It was just after midnight on August 30th when she found herself without lodging for the night. Mary Ann had been staying at the Frying Pan public house and rented a bed by the night. The fee for her bed was 4 pence, and she was short the requisite amount. We know that her normal roommate at the inn talked with her at the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road around 1:30 in the morning, a corner which is only 1 street over from where Martha's body was found just 3 weeks prior. Mary Ann's corpse was located on Bucks Road about 3:45 in the morning, which is approximately a quarter of a mile from the corner where she was last seen. In fact, All the future victims of the canonical five were found exceptionally close to one another within the Whitechapel area. 5 of her teeth were missing, and she had severe bruising on her face. Her throat had been slashed with exceptional violence as it cut its way all the way down to her spinal column. Slashes in her lower abdomen caused her bowels to protrude. It was found that all of the cuts were made with a long-bladed knife. The next victim, Annie Chapman, much like Marianne Nichols, had been turned away from the public house around 1:50 a.m. because she was short of the money she needed to rent a bed for the night. This was the night of September 8th, just a month after Martha's body had been found, and just a week after Marianne had been savaged by the Ripper. As she searched for another place to lodge for the night, she met the Ripper and her untimely demise. Her body was found a quarter of a mile away from her normal lodging house at 6 a.m. by a man on his way to work. She was found in the back of 29 Hanbury Street, lying in a passage used by the ladies of negotiable delights and their clientele. Annie had been suffocated, her throat cut, and was mutilated post-mortem. Her rings were gone, and 2 farthings lay by her side. After Annie's body was found, it was suspected that Jack had anatomical knowledge and might be conducting some occult rituals with each murder victim. Then the Ripper struck again. 3 weeks later, he killed 2 women, Elizabeth Stride, a registered prostitute, and Catherine Eddowes, within the span of a single hour. Elizabeth was last seen by a police constable at 12:35 in the morning, talking with a man wearing a deerstalker hat and a black cutaway coat. At 1 a.m., a man driving a pony cart came upon a bundle on the ground. Elizabeth's throat had been deeply cut. Catherine was the Ripper's second victim that night. She was known to tipple a drink regularly. That evening, she was so drunk that the police locked her up at around 8:30 to protect her. After spending a couple of hours sleeping it off, Catherine was let go at 1 a.m. after sobering up. In an interesting side note, before she left the police station, she teased the police that she knew the identity of the Ripper, but would not divulge it. Shortly after being released, she met the Ripper. Whether she knew him as she had intimated or not, it did not matter. Her throat was cut to the bone, and several internal organs were removed. Near the body lay a shawl on the ground that was thought to have belonged to her, and it was collected as evidence. The Ripper took some time off, and then on November 9th, he killed the last of his 5 official victims when he slew Mary Jane Kelly. Once again, another prostitute. She was seen walking with a man to her lodging, and was heard singing until about 1 a.m. In the morning, a rent collector came to her door to get the daily fee. When no one answered, he gazed through the window and saw the horror left in the Ripper's wake. In addition to organs being taken, including the heart, she was slashed and mutilated in such grotesque ways, I will not elucidate upon them in this podcast. The reign of terror that was Jack the Ripper officially came to an end after Mary Jane Kelly and the London police were searching high and low looking for a man lurking around Whitechapel at night who might fit the description. Tall, cutaway coat, distinctive hats, sought-out drunken prostitutes with no lodging for the night, and he may have been someone with anatomical knowledge. Of course, with any high-profile murder, there were other people seeking out the identity of Jack the Ripper alongside the police, and few, if any, were more prolific than psychic detectives. During Jack's reign of terror near the end of the 19th century, the spiritualist renaissance that had started 40 years earlier with the Fox sisters in western New York had found its way to Europe. The UK was full of spiritualists. In fact, the Society for Psychical Research had been founded a full 6 years before the Ripper murders to examine spiritualist claims. Various spiritualist circles were held in order to try to ascertain the identity of the Ripper through mediumship. Names and locations were bandied about by spiritualists who claimed to have knowledge from the nether realms that would inevitably lead to his arrest. Contrarian information was given to the police. Some groups offered up street names where he lived. One group said he was a farmer or a laborer with weird scars. Yet another group said that a member of the clergy was responsible. All of this resulted in noise that detracted from the investigation, rather than helping it. But there were some outliers that came forward with evidence that may have been quite valuable had it been followed up upon. One such outlier was a well-known medium at the time. Robert James Lees had been aware of his clairvoyancy since childhood. He started out in life as a journalist, and then became a spiritualist preacher later in life. Lees wrote several books dictated by spirit guides on spiritualism in order to help people understand the phenomenon. He had gained a reputation for legitimate spirit communication, so much so that Queen Victoria often called upon him for advice. One night, after the third murder attributed to the Ripper, a vision overtook Lees of a narrow court and a bar. Inside the bar was a clock that read 12:40, closing time by law. He saw a man walk out from the shadows of the court, cover the mouth of a lady who was drunk. He slit her throat and stabbed her repeatedly. He immediately wrote this vision down in his diary. Then Lees did what any psychic detective should do. He went to the police with his vision. At the police station, he was demeaned and faced unbridled skepticism from investigators as a result. When the next Ripper murder occurred, the time, location, and manner of death were also mirrored in visions that Lee had had. Finally, Lees went around the local constables who had spurned him and contacted Scotland Yard directly. He offered to help them if he had any further visions. Unfortunately, there were no more premonitory visions of the Ripper nor his victims during the Ripper's reign of terror. Several years later, in 1895, Lees had another vision of one of the murders being committed. He saw the Ripper, who was wearing a dark tweed suit with a light-colored overcoat. On a momentous occasion of synchronicity, a short while after this final vision, Lee was riding in a horse-drawn carriage when an urge compelled him to come to a full stop. Focusing his intuition as a psychic detective, he knew that the Ripper was in the area. Eventually, his supernatural senses fixated upon an individual on the street, whom he then proceeded to follow on foot. While in stealth pursuit, Lees happened upon a policeman and an inspector who both treated him indignantly when he explained what he was doing. Unbeknownst to Lees, the man he had been following was in fact the lead suspect in the Ripper case, a physician by the name of Dr. William Wythe Gull. A short time thereafter, he had another vision and proceeded to contact the police. He led the inspector via a psychic trail to the Ripper's house, the home of Dr. Gull. This psychic trail was supplemented by the knowledge obtained from that repository of mysterious understanding that psychic detectives can tap into. Lees told the police that the Ripper's wife worked at the royal court and that she and the Ripper had a child together. It is confirmed that Lees arrived at Gull's home as his wife acknowledged later that a medium and a police officer arrived at her door and asked impertinent questions. Lees' work arrived with mass market interest. Through the work of Lees, psychic detective work had been instilled in the public consciousness. Mediums might be able to call upon unseen knowledge and could solve crimes in a fantastic fashion. This also gave credence to the idea that spiritualism may have more legitimacy than many had expected. And while the name of Lees and his work on the Ripper case may not be known by many, even by those who study the paranormal, it has been embraced by Hollywood. Lees was fictionalized as an amalgamated character in a movie, very loosely based upon Jack the Ripper. This movie was entitled From Hell. That memorable character was called Aberline in the movie, and he was played by the very versatile actor, Johnny Depp. There have been many other psychics who have laid claim to solving the mystery of Jack the Ripper, but findings based upon corporeal feelings simply cannot be substantiated decades or even centuries past the time of the crime. Unfortunately, the identity of the Ripper may never be known. You may recall earlier when we covered the murder of Catherine Eddowes that a shawl had been found near her body. The shawl was impressive. It was made of fine silk and measured 8 feet in length, and was recovered on the scene by Acting Sergeant Simpson. He passed it down through his family, and then it was sold in 2007, so DNA analysis could be conducted upon the shawl fibers. 2 university researchers teamed up and found that some of the DNA was still viable. The researchers published their methods and their results in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. Their findings were released to the public at large in 2014 in a book entitled Naming Jack the Ripper. On the shawl, they found blood that matched Eddowes and a sperm sample that matched a 23-year-old Polish barber named Aaron Kosminski. They figured out that the sample was from the Polish barber through using familial DNA from a modern relative of Kosminski. It is very interesting that Kosminski was one of the top suspects that police were investigating. There is no way to prove it was Kosminski because there is no current technology that can affirm the blood and sperm were deposited at the same time. Also, it should be noted that when analysis was conducted, relatives of Kosminski and Eddowes were present. This has given skeptics fodder for their belief that the samples may be contaminated from their presence. We may never know Jack the Ripper's true identity. The facts of the gruesome slasher are still poured over by each passing generation, as the fascination with true crime never seems to ebb. Was it the Polish barber? Or maybe it was the esteemed Dr. Gull, as seen in Psychic Visions by Robert James Lees? We will never know. What we do know is that the mystery of Jack the Ripper is as captivating today as it was in the late 19th century. And whenever there is a case that is sensationalized, there will be psychic detectives who believe that they hold the key to solving the crime. Hopefully this episode made a little of our paranormal world more normal for you. As always, if you have any personal anecdotes, observations, or alternate explanations you would like to share on this or any other topic we've covered, or just maybe you would like to drop a note to say hi, you can always reach us via our email, contact@walkintheshadows.com. Once again, that's contact, spelled CONTACT, @walkintheshadows.com. If you want to learn more about this podcast or myself, please visit our Walk in the Shadows website. The link is in the show notes. On our website, you can find all of our social media accounts, our mailing list, and our Patreon should you decide to support us. Your support directly helps us keep high-quality paranormal content delivered regularly to the podcast player of your choice. If you think what Walk in the Shadows offers is a valuable service for sating your paranormal curiosity, subscribe and review this podcast. And please, tell a friend or share on social media. It really does help. Most importantly, thank you for your time spent walking in the shadows with me. I know your time is valuable, so I really appreciate you being here in this moment. Until next episode, may you and yours be healthy, prosperous, and treated with kindness by everyone and everything you meet, both in the light and in the shadows.